Hello, welcome to our first video on how to sew and quilt with low vision or blindness. We're going to share some tips, tools, and techniques, starting with selecting your fabric. So, selecting fabric can be an exciting time as well as a frustrating time if you have low vision or blindness. Quilting historically has been a very visual project. Our goal is to help make quilting accessible. So let's talk about purchasing fabric. We want to provide some tips and techniques that will help you to be most successful in your quilting efforts. When you're buying fabric, you have some choices. You can buy it from a local fabric store or one of the big box fabric stores like Joann's. You can even go online and find places to buy your fabric. And I will include some references to some well-known and popular fabric stores in the notes below this video. When you're buying fabric, you'll have to consider colors, patterns, and when you're considering colors, you want to think about, is it a light, medium, or dark shade? Is the pattern small, medium, or large? And how you're going to mix those colors and patterns together. It can be a lot to consider. One way to help with this process is to work with what they call pre-cuts. And many of you probably have heard of pre-cuts before. This is fabric that is sold in pre-cut squares or strips, and they're typically provided in bundles that are represented by a designer's work, and that designer will prepare a set of their fabrics that are usually very complementary. So if you buy a pre-cut set of, let's say mini charms, which are 2.5-inch squares, their mini charm pack probably has some very complementary patterns, styles, and colors. So it's something to consider, because then you don't have to go through the work of picking out all those different designs and figuring out if they work together. The designer has done it for you. The other nice thing about pre-cuts is that it already provides you with your basic shapes for quilting. So if you want to use 2.5-inch squares in your patchwork quilt, or 5-inch squares or 10-inch squares, they all are available in pre-cuts. Now, one disadvantage to those pre-cuts is making sure that you can get enough of the same type of pre-cuts that you need for your quilting project. Sometimes they may have limited amounts of that particular type of pre-cut fabric and pattern available. So be wary of that. If you're going to work on a large quilt, make sure that you can get enough of the same type of pre-cuts so that you can complete your project. So another obvious advantage of pre-cuts is you don't have to cut the squares, which can be a challenge when you are blind or have low vision. They're already pre-cut and most often are pretty perfect, so you don't have to worry about trying to do it with scissors or with a rotary cutter, which are other options. I highly recommend staying away from a rotary cutter if you don't already have a lot of experience and are comfortable with it, because a rotary cutter, which is basically a round blade on a handle that you roll against a cutting mat, and this is an example of a cutting mat with your fabric on top of it. So it's very visual in nature. You need to be able to look at a grid ruler mat or grid mat and have your fabric against that mat, so you know how many inches you're cutting, to set up your square. You also need another ruler, which is usually see-through, so that you can line that up with your mat and make sure that you're able to precisely cut out the shape that you want from your fabric. It's very visual. It's very error prone, even for people with who are fully sighted. It can be a frustrating situation when you go to cut your 5-inch squares and after you've done a bunch of them realize you were, just a little bit off, and that little bit can make a big difference in your points lining up in your quilt. So again, just my opinion, the rotary cutter option is something that really I would leave to people who have a lot of experience in using them and feel comfortable and safe in doing so. Precut's great option, can be a little expensive, but you can get a lot of bang for your buck by having those nice complementary designs and patterns and everything cut to shape. Another option exists, however, that I would highly recommend as well if you're willing to do a little bit of an upfront investment in tools, and that is die cutting machines. Die cutting machines are a great way for you to get started with quilting. Whether you're low vision or blind, you can safely do this and produce really accurate squares, half square triangles, strips, even applique designs using this method. I personally have a Sizzix machine, and that's Sizzix, and they provide various machines of various sizes that work with both paper and fabric. You do want to make sure you get the version that will cut fabric. And how these work is they use what they call a die. It has a foam on the top and it's a hard plastic on the bottom. And within the foam is embedded a blade is designed in the shape of whatever you want to cut. What you do with this is you take this die and you put your fabric on top of it. So, and the nice thing about these machines as well is that you can cut several layers. I've cut 6 to 8 layers, sometimes even 10 layers of fabric all at one time using this process. So I have 2 10-inch squares here that I cut or folded in half, and I'm going to lay that on top of my die on the foam side. And so now that's laying flat on top of the foam with the blades underneath it. And then I am going to walk over to my Sizzix machine so I can show you how we use this to cut out our shapes and how easy it is to do. Okay, so now I'm here with my Sizzix Big Shot Pro machine. Now this is pretty big. It has a long bed. The reason I have this is because I work with a lot of projects where I have to mass produce a large amount of different fabric shapes for Mitzi Kit. This also has the longer bed so that I can do the larger projects like really long strips or really wide squares. If you only want to do 5-inch or 6-inch squares, you don't need to get into this size machine, die cutting machine. You can do something smaller, which does the same job. So, but to show you how this works, how simple and easy it is, I have my die with the fabric on top, and then they have these plastic cutting pads that go on top of your fabric. You want to line it up so that the end of the cutting board is lined up with the end of the die. The fabric is sandwiched in between with the die underneath. And then I'm simply going to put this on the bed of my Sizzix Pro machine. And you'll see there's this crank in the middle of my machine, die cutting machine, and that is attached to this middle section, which basically is the roller. And this roller is going to help me compress the fabric onto the die cutting blades to produce my shapes. So I'll show you how easy that is. So I put the die here, my fabric's on top of it, my cutting pad is on top of that. I'm going to get this die so that it's just underneath the beginnings of this centerpiece. And then I'm going to use this crank to crank through and gently push on the edge. Crank through the die. And it takes a little bit of muscle, not too bad. And through. And once it comes through to the other side, that's simple. I remove that plastic sheet from the top, and you can already see all these squares. So I had 4 layers of fabric, and there are 4 2.5 inch squares. 2.5 inch squares like that. Awesome. And the nice thing, they're perfect. You don't have to worry about them being off at all, unless you didn't set your fabric up correctly. So one caveat to that is, if you're trying to conserve fabric when you lay it on your die, make sure that your fabric is completely covering that die cutting area with your shape. Otherwise, obviously, if you didn't have your fabric going over the entire shape, you would be missing part of your squares. So very easy to use, very accurate, and very friendly. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope you've learned some things. What I'm going to do is to provide more details in the description and notes below this video so that you can see where you can find these different types of resources, like your Precuts or these Sizzix die cutting machine. The other die cutting machine is the AccuQuilt, which is very popular as well. And you can look at the different prices. These can range, anywhere from the low hundreds to the upper hundreds. They also come in both manual, like I have with the crank, or electronic versions. I tend to like the manual versions because to me it's simpler to operate, and I always think the less fancy options, the more likelihood it's easier to maintain. So that's my tips for selecting and cutting fabrics. One other option that I'd like to leave with you is to consider how to evaluate the right side of your fabric. Now, if you're totally blind, then that's a problem, right? Knowing, because after you cut your fabric, you want to know what is the right side of my fabric that I am going to work with on my quilt. And one obvious thing that we have to consider when there is low vision or blindness involved is we have to be organized, right? I mean, that's what my mom has taught me, because living with my mom, who's totally blind, if I move something that, she put in a particular place, then I have messed up her world, because that's what she depends on. She knows that I always have this in its place. So sewing, quilting, same thing. You've got to get your space organized. So one of the things with fabric is having different baskets or different bins that you can put your fabric in. Once you've identified your white fabric from your black fabric, you can put them in different bins and have little indicators. If you read Braille, you could have Braille labels. If you don't read Braille, you could put some, I like to use things like paper clips or clothespins and decode references. So I'll say 1 clothespin means black, 2 clothespins means white, right? And have that organized so that I always know where my fabric is. The other thing that is important is when you purchase your fabric, if you don't know what the right side is from the wrong side of your fabric, to either get a sighted friend to help you identify them, or there's an app called Be My Eyes. BEMYEYES, and it's free. And basically, it depends on volunteers and people with smartphones. So you do need a smartphone in order to take advantage of this. But you can call in to the Be My Eyes app folks at any time, and a volunteer will answer. And they are available to help people with low vision or blindness to look at things and identify things for you through their smart app on the phone. It's a great resource. And if you have some fabric and you just don't know which side is right side, they can help you identify it. Now, once you've identified, that's where the organization comes in. You're going to want to put a safety pin on the right side of the fabric. So, what I would recommend is before you cut your fabric, put the safety pin on the right side, and when you cut strips to put through your die cutting machine, you make sure to move that safety pin to the remnant of your fabric on the right side again. So you always know you're working with the right side. And then when you stack your fabric, make sure that you're stacking it with the right side on top and keeping it in your bins. So just some organization tips. I know it's a lot harder than what it probably sounds, right? But it is important to keep organized. The Be My Eyes app, great resource. I hope you'll try it out if you haven't already. So these are some tips. Again, selecting your fabric, identifying the right side of your fabric, getting pre-cuts, or cutting your own fabric with some die cutting machines. If you happen to already know how to use a rotary cutter and a rotary blade with a mat, more power to you. I just don't usually recommend those things for people who don't have that experience, because they can be rather tricky, as well as they are not always the best in producing accurate cuts when you can't see that well. So thank you so much. If you have any questions at all, feel free to contact us at 978-419-1824, and check out the notes below for more resources to follow up on your options. Please hit subscribe and share with your friends. Take care.